It is my pleasure to be joined by Professor Nigel Biggar. He is an Emeritus Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University in the UK. He is also the Chairman of the Free Speech Union in the UK and a published author. Nigel, kia ora, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
This topic of colonialism, or looking at ethics and empire, this is a topic which has got you in a fair amount of trouble, I understand.
It has, Andrew. Yes, I got into trouble about 7 years ago when a project of mine on ethics and empire was the subject of a considered campaign of 3 online denunciations to shut it down. I survived. You can see I'm still here. I then was offered a contract to write an intelligent person's guide to colonialism, produced the book, but the publisher then backed off and said that public feeling was unfavourable for publication. Another publisher, HarperCollins, William Collins, came along and saved the book. So I've been subject to 2 attempts to cancel me. Both were unpleasant, but I survived both.
What is the fascination as a professor of ethics and theology? What drew you to the topic of empire and colonialism?
So, Andrew, in my career, I have made it my business to try and make moral sense of a number of complicated issues. For example, the political business of making peace and doing justice after civil conflict in Northern Ireland or South Africa. The very complicated business of when, if ever, should one go to war and how should one fight, ethics of war.
Yeah.
And then colonialism, I realized about 10 years ago, actually, that colonial history was being used for political purposes and distorted and abused for political purposes that I regarded as destructive. I'm Scottish. During the referendum on Scottish independence of 2014, I came across arguments in favour of Scottish separatism, in favour of the disintegration of the UK, which ran Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, Scotland should be independent from this wicked post-imperial country called Britain. And I'd read enough imperial history to know that the equation empire equals evil is not historically tenable.
When it comes to colonialism or colonization more generally, I mean, different terms, one's more loaded than the other, but how would you define them, Nigel?
Andrew, I prefer to avoid colonialism because it implies that an empire or colonial endeavor was an ism. It was a kind of coherent ideology, a coherent theory. It wasn't. I mean, the emergence of the British Empire was ad hoc. People responding to different threats, different opportunities in different ways. There was no one woke up in London one Sunday morning and thought, let's go and conquer the world.
Yep.
It's fun to lord it over other people. It wasn't like that. So I try and avoid ism altogether. It's in the title simply because colonialism is a target for certain people. And part of the aim of the book actually is to say, the British Empire and its colonial expansion was all sorts of different things. It wasn't a single thing. But as for what's an empire is simply one people who dominates other peoples, different forms of domination. Right now, in the West, we are dominated by the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of soft empire. So an empire is where one people dominates another. Colonies are more specific. It's more when the dominant people sends its own people to far-flung parts of the world.
Yep.
Probably the first instances of that kind of colonization would be when the Greeks and Romans, or the Phoenicians or the Carthaginians, sent their peoples to different parts of the Mediterranean and set up literally colonies of their people on the shores of Sicily and North Africa.
Mm. In terms of colonization, that has had, varied outcomes, particularly for the indigenous peoples of various parts of the world who have been colonized, as it were. And for the most part, less than ideal outcomes. And we certainly see the situation in New Zealand and in North America and in parts of Africa as well, where there are continuing impacts of what happened with colonial settlers back in the day, where indigenous people are doing less well than perhaps the average population. Do you see that as perhaps one of the negative aspects of colonization?
Yes, I do, but I think I'll say three things on this. Well, one is, let's put this in context. In the 1600s, the Iroquois in North America, south of the Great Lakes, expanded northwards, overwhelmed the Huron, sent the Huron and other Native American peoples westward. That was a form of imperial expansion. 1700s, the Comanche in the southwest of what's now the US expand, overwhelm the Apache, and establish what one historian calls a vast slave economy. 1820s, the Zulu expand westward, scattering African peoples to three of the four winds in what they now refer to as the Intricani, the crushing. And in 1835, the Maori sail to the Chatham Islands, and when they pitch up there, they kill 10% of the Maori population and enslave the rest. So, first of all, let's put this in context. Lots of people were migrating and overwhelming other peoples. Secondly, yes, I mean, the impact of European settlement in North America, and particularly Australia and New Zealand, was shocking because the cultural difference, the difference in power, was so considerable. And also because of the importation of disease. Europeans had been accustomed to living with domesticated animals, became immunized against the kind of diseases that they carry, but they brought those diseases or the pathogens to North America and Australia and New Zealand, where the indigenous peoples were not immunized. And so one historian says that in North America in the 1700s, if a Native American people suffered successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period, their population would decline by 90%. But the point here is that was really tragic, terrible.
Yeah.
No one intended to do it, so no one can be blamed any more than the fact that Indonesian fishermen brought smallpox to the northern territories of Australia. Can't be blamed on them; they didn't intend to do it.
Yeah.
It's just tragic. But that was one of the major, most shocking impacts of European expansion to parts of the world like Australia and New Zealand.
When we look back at that, I suppose, and look at some of the inequities that still continue within Indigenous populations, and certainly for Māori in New Zealand, disproportionately represented in terms of the worst type of statistics with incarceration and health outcomes and education, etc.
Yes.
Is there something that can be done to help redress the balance? Now, there's a lot of talk about decolonization, for example. I'm not entirely sure what that term means or whether that's an effective strategy. But given that colonization has had a negative impact on people, is there a moral right? Is there an ethical dilemma of, so what should we do with that? What should we do to restore equity within the population?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Andrew. And so first thing to say is, yes, if there are groups of citizens in New Zealand or Australia or Britain, perhaps marked by their ethnicity, who appear to have relative disadvantages, we should seek to redress those disadvantages as best we can. Some people say, well, the cause of the disadvantage lies in what happened 200 years ago, and what's happened is that there's been intergenerational trauma passed down the generations, so the cause lies back there. So we need to go back to Waitangi and try and sort out what went wrong there. I'm skeptical because between 1840 and 2024, an awful lot has happened. Other causes have come in. I don't know what the situation in New Zealand is in terms of Indigenous people. In Australia, it's reckoned that 3% of the population is reckoned to be more or less Aboriginal. 80% of those are more or less integrated into mainstream wage-earning, more or less urban Australian society. There's a bit of a gap in terms of average outcomes between Aboriginal Australians and the rest of Australians, but the gap is closing. The real problem has to do with the 20% of Aborigines in remote parts of Australia, particularly the Northern Territory, who suffer very multiple forms of social dysfunction. Now, I guess my point is this. If the cause of current dysfunction were intergenerational trauma, how come all Aborigines in Australia aren't suffering from it, because 80% aren't, which suggests that actually there are other causes that have come in. So my view, generally speaking, is we can't really undo what happened 200 years ago or 150 years ago. What we can do is address the problems as they present themselves now. If that involves the return of stolen land, so be it. If it involves gaining a higher estimation for the virtues of Maori culture, so be it. But let's address the problems as they present themselves in terms of family breakdown, in terms of the abuse of women by men, in terms of low educational achievement. I think those are best addressed in terms of present causes than those 200 years ago. And by the way, trying to make all white people in New Zealand feel guilty for what happened in the past is not fair, partly because they didn't do it. No one living now was there in the 1840s. And it doesn't help race relations. But by all means, let's address the present problems as efficiently as we can. And now people might look at Nigel Biggar and say, well, he's an old white man. He would say that, wouldn't he? But certainly there are Aboriginal Australians like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine who more or less agree with me. And I imagine among Maori in New Zealand, there's a variety of opinion as to how best to address the relative disadvantage that some Maori suffer from.
For some people, it is as simple as saying, well, colonization is what has caused this trauma to our people, as you mentioned beforehand. And so the answer to this is a relatively new term, which is decolonization. As I mentioned, I'm at a bit of a loss to exactly what this means and what this could look like practically. How would you define the term decolonization?
And it depends on which context we're talking about. In Britain, decolonization, let's say in schools and universities, would mean that we need to introduce more diverse authors onto reading lists. Now, what's meant by that is unclear. I guess more people with non-white skins onto reading lists because there's a Eurocentric bias. And there's also a notion that unless a non-white person can find a non-white author on a reading list, they can't identify with it. I'm not sure that's true myself. That's what's meant there. Here, so the claim is that the current disadvantages from which some Maori suffer has to do with what happened through colonization. And to some extent that may be true, but as I say, the effects on different Maori are different, so other things have happened. But the other thing to say is, yes, colonization was shocking for many indigenous peoples, but colonization also brought good things too. The colonization of New Zealand ended. Yes, Maori bought muskets from white people, but Maori bought them, Maori used them. That's up to the Maori. But the imposition of colonial government suppressed inter-ethnic violence among Maori, and it also introduced liberal institutions so that now New Zealand, along with Canada, Australia, and Britain, are among the most liberal countries on earth. And because New Zealand has liberal institutions, that's why you're having a discussion about how to do justice to native peoples in the past. They ain't having that discussion in China. So, at least not last time I looked.
Exactly. Well, what could decolonization look like? More than just the reading lists. I suppose rather than just say, "Hey, the problems that we now have were caused back in 1840, so we can't go back to 1840." Do you think decolonization is an appropriate strategy, or is this just a word which has been hijacked with people with a certain agenda, perhaps?
I'm generally skeptical of it. I think it's okay. It does make sense insofar as, let's say, indigenous or Maori culture has been unfairly disparaged. So, by all means, let's have a new National Museum in Auckland. Let's have an exhibition of Maori culture. I visited it. It's very interesting and quite remarkable, actually. Although I didn't look at the exhibition thoroughly, but here's perhaps the negative thing of the notion of decolonization. What it often means is a relentlessly negative disparagement of white colonizers, which is often unfair, and an idealization of indigenous cultures. I've visited the Museum of Tasmania in Hobart. I visited the Australian Museum in Sydney. I visited your museum here in Auckland. Each of them have exhibitions of indigenous culture. Every one of them, I think, is a bit idealizing. So, for example, here in Auckland, I may be mistaken, I didn't look at everything. There was mention of the terrible bloodshed suffered by Maori during the Muscat Wars.
Yeah.
No mention, I think, of the custom of cannibalism among some Maori. And I believe, if I remember rightly, there's also something of a trade in heads, as well as enslavement. I don't think the museum's exhibition says anything about that.
No.
So there's a bit of
revisionist history, perhaps?
bit of editing, censoring of the Maori story. So my view is we need to, museums and educational institutions need to tell the truth, the whole truth, the unvarnished truth, but the whole truth. The bad stuff that settlers did, but the good stuff. The good things about Maori culture, but also the not so good stuff. So the danger of decolonization is it simply replaces one imbalanced story with another imbalanced story.
I mean, you've certainly attempted to do that and done that very thoroughly with the Colonialism book, looking at the good, the bad, and the downright ugly of the British Empire in different parts of the world, including New Zealand. But I understand this is part of the criticism that you've received. When we talk about colonialism, we can only talk about it in some circles as this terrible thing that has happened, rather than recognizing the good things that it brought.
Yeah, well, as I'm glad you mentioned that, Andrew, because some of my critics accuse me of whitewashing the British Empire, and as you've said, I'm glad you said it, I try and be as honest as possible about the bad stuff, and if the reader doubts it, look at page 276, the whole list of bad stuff. But what my critics just will not admit is that the British Empire did anything good. And if the reader wants to see on page 277, there's a list of the good stuff that the British Empire helped to achieve. I have one relentless obsessive critic in Britain called Alan Lester, Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex. And Alan wrote a 15,000-word review of my book, published in the Journal of Imperial Commonwealth Studies, in which he could not find a single positive thing to say about my book, or a single positive thing to say about the British Empire. Now, I think I've formed a fairly balanced judgment of my own work, and I know I can make mistakes, but I know it wasn't that bad. And I've written a few reviews in my time, and I've never been able to write a review I couldn't say something good about the book. But apart from that, I know perfectly well, and since you've read my book, you know too, whatever overall judgment you reach about colonialism and British Empire, you cannot say it didn't achieve anything good. But Alan just can't admit that. So on the decolonizer side, on the anti-colonialist side, there is a willful refusal to recognize the moral complexity of the farm. So there was a famous Nigerian nationalist novelist, Chinua Achebe, who, as I say, was a nationalist. He supported decolonization, the original decolonization of Nigeria. But in 2013, just before he died, some Iranian journalists were pressing him to condemn the British Empire. And he said no. He said it's complicated. Because particularly after decolonization, Nigerian government became, it was unstable, institution didn't work properly, the rule of law was compromised, and by comparison, in spite of the flaws of British colonial government, Achebe recognized that actually the British colonial government and British justice, which he said was severe, but he said it was reliable. So Achebe, notwithstanding his African nationalism, toward the end of his life was a bit chastened in terms of just how bad colonialism was and just how good post-colonialism was.
It is complicated, as you say, and with your free speech hat on, I suppose, whilst you defend the rights of people who have an attitude of decolonization,
Yes.
that is their right to say that, having people with different opinions who are communicating the stories of our nations,
Yeah.
rather than just having, oh no, this is the official version of it, we don't talk about that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
a bit problematic in many parts of the world.
Yes, I have absolutely no objection to decolonizers and anti-colonialists or just revisionist historians pointing out the bad things that happened in New Zealand, the bad things that settlers did, the things colonial government failed to do, the ambiguities of the Waitangi Treaty. That's part of the truth. And no credible account of the past can avoid those things, and I try not to avoid them. So that's fine. But when I try to give expression to this nuanced view in 2017, the reaction of those on the more, I guess, the more intolerant, illiberal, progressive left was to try and shut me down.
Yeah.
And that is what is not acceptable, because we need a society, I think, where citizens are free to express their doubts, to test prevailing opinions, because sometimes the prevailing opinions are wrong.
Mm.
And if they end up governing our institutions and shaping or misshaping public policy, domestic and foreign, then everybody in New Zealand, everyone in Britain suffers. We need to be able to test ideas. And so my views and my book are a challenge to this relentlessly negative story about Britain and New Zealand's colonial past as simply a litany of racism and oppression and exploitation. It involved elements of all those, but it also involved elements of the opposite. So we need to be able to say that.
Yeah. Nigel Biggar, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks, Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.